Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last live learning session for our sampling course and our last class of this week as well. I hope everyone had a really good day. I hope everyone is ready to dive into our last couple of topics, which are ethics and privacy in sampling. Then we'll go through a quick little review of what we covered in the last couple of weeks. It probably won't take the whole 2.5 hours, but I'm sure no one will complain if you get to get out of here early and have time to work on your assignments. Before we really start, a couple of things. If your assignment 1 submission was either missing or incomplete, or if the link wasn't working, like you pulled it to the wrong place, you should have received an email from me notifying you of that fact earlier this evening. If your assignment is missing, if you haven't submitted anything, please try to submit it by the 30th at the very latest, or we can't mark it after that date. If it was incomplete, you should be able to go to your pull request and see a comment from whichever learning support marked it. They'll tell you kind of what changes you should be making. So please go and make those changes again before the 30th so that we can give you that complete mark and be done with that. Overall, really happy with how you guys did on assignment 1. I looked over a few of them, looked over the feedback. I think most people did a really wonderful job, and the few who got the incompletes, they're minor things, not like major overhauls. So thank you for the great work on that. Other announcement, and I'm going to say it at the top of class instead of the end so that I don't forget to mention it to you guys. Next Tuesday is Canada Day, a federal holiday. So the first class of our visualization course is not going to be on Tuesday, July 1st, but on Wednesday, July 2nd. And we'll just have an extra Tuesday kind of at the end for our real final class. So please don't show up to an empty Zoom call next Tuesday. And if I show up to an empty Zoom call, which might happen because I might forget, you can feel free to make fun of me. If there's any questions about the assignment, we can definitely dig into that during office hours, or again, you can message me or whichever learning support graded your work. Otherwise, if there are no questions about timing, scheduling assignments, and I'll wait a couple seconds just in case anyone needs to type. But if there's no more questions on that, then we can get into our first topic for today, which is sampling ethics. The disclaimer here is that we could spend an entire course on data science ethics more broadly. So today we're just going to be covering some big ideas, right? Why these ethics concepts matter to us in our sampling world that we've been hanging out in for the last 2 weeks. We're going to talk about some different ethical requirements for doing survey sampling. We'll introduce the concept of respondent burden as kind of a metric in our ethical considerations. And as I said, this is an intro to the topic. If you'd like to read more about ethics and sampling on your own time, there's a list on the slide with some links to articles and kind of discussions that go into it in a lot more detail than we're going to cover here. So again, if this topic is interesting to you or relevant to your work, these are some nice starting places to dig into. And again, written in a few different professional or academic contexts. So to start off, to see why it's so important that we're going to spend time talking about sampling ethics, I always think it's helpful to see an example of, okay, if you're out there and you're trying to actually do survey or interview-based research, here's the kind of documentation that you have to provide, and here's how high the bar has to be in terms of ethical considerations before you even start the work. So for this particular example, I'm going to show you one of my ethics applications just from U of T. There are comparable ethics processes that you would go through doing data science or research-focused work in the public sector, in certain industry contexts. Not all of them will be as intensely detailed as an academic ethics app, so I figured we'll walk through the scary, kind of long, intense one, and then when you're in the real world, most other mandatory ethics documentation will seem a little bit less intense in comparison. So again, this is just a sample form of the Human Participant Ethics Protocol for a project that I did/am doing. So you have to summarize the project, talk about why you're doing it, talk about your study design, how you're going to be collecting your data, what kind of questions you're asking, how you're going to be analyzing that data. And then here's the stuff where it gets really relevant to us. We have to describe who are our participants. What are these specific inclusion criteria for those participants to be involved in our study? How will we be recruiting them? So in my case, you can see that I'm doing purposive sampling technique, kind of describing that what the population could look like, how we're going to be recruiting. what kind of sample size we're going to be using and why that sample size is appropriate here. What else? Why we're qualified to do that kind of work. Then relevant to our ethics content today, what are some potential risks to the participants? So psychological risks, physical risks, social risks, legal risks, anything that could possibly happen to people participating in this work. And then also benefits. How will our participants benefit from doing this study? How will we obtain consent for them? How do we make sure that they're competent to give consent? How are we sharing our findings? How are people allowed to withdraw? So if they decide, like the sensitive questions that we talked about yesterday, if they decide, I don't want to answer this, I don't want to do this anymore, how do they back out of that? What happens to their data if they do decide to back out of that? Are there any circumstances where they can't back out of that? And then another thing that we're going to get into today, how are we going to protect people's privacy, their anonymity? How are we going to store our data in a secure and safe way? Overall, what do we think is the vulnerability and the risk of doing this research? So again, a pretty extensive ethics protocol has to be submitted before I even get to start doing this kind of work. My experience, academic ethics protocols are a little bit higher bar to clear usually than in other professional contexts, but there's still, at least for me in government, there were always documents to fill out, always ethics consultations to do. So it's helpful for you before you start doing sampling work to already start thinking of these questions so you don't have to be surprised with them at the very last minute. I see Hiroyoshi is sympathizing with me in the chat. They're not exactly fun to fill out, but once you do them off the top, they're kind of a helpful roadmap for the rest of the project that you're going to be doing. So having seen kind of the extent to which we need to be thinking about ethics, let's start doing some of that thinking now with one of the central ideas to survey and sampling ethics, which is respondent burden. Basically, respondent burden is any risk, inconvenience, discomfort that our participants could face from participating in our study or our survey. If the burden for any one participant is greater than the potential benefits they could get from being in that study has what we call a net burden. Maybe the last equation that we're going to see, and I think a much less intimidating one this time, total participant burden is the net burden per participant times the number of participants. Of course, if burdens take the form of being, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this question, that's a hard thing to quantify, but the point of this equation is just for us to think about the fact that we need to consider burdens in aggregate. So even if we're just making our participants a little tiny bit uncomfortable, when that's happening to a lot of people, that's a lot of total burden that we're inflicting. So we need to be aware of respondent burden as we're designing our surveys, first and foremost, just because in doing any kind of data science or data adjacent work, our goal has to be not to harm people. Ideally, we're going to do something good, but our baseline is like, okay, our survey cannot be actively hurting people physically, mentally, emotionally. That's our responsibility as the people administering this survey, as the people taking this sample. If that kind of moral argument doesn't convince you to care about this stuff, other line of argument is that if our respondent burden gets too big, it can actually affect our data quality in a negative way. So purely on the level of us wanting results, we have to think about ethics to actually make our survey better, to get better data. So the reasoning for this, if our survey is really, really mentally taxing to do, think about the sensitive questions we talked about the other day, that really long survey made you guys look at all those different options. If there's a really high burden, participants might just avoid answering those questions. They might just refuse to participate at all, drop out of the study. Maybe instead of not responding, they'll still respond, but they'll give these rushed or inaccurate answers because they just want to get it over with. And as we know, that leads to measurement error, that leads to non-response. We're not getting accurate or true information for our sample. And then finally, a new idea for us is survey sustainability. If our survey or our interview or our sampling procedure is intense and traumatizing for the people involved, people talk to each other, right? Once our target population learns that this survey is this horrible, burdensome experience, they're not going to want to do it. We're not going to be able to recruit other participants. If we're doing a longitudinal study, so repeated engagements with the same individuals, those participants are not going to want to come back. So there's both moral and very practical reasons for why we need to consider respondent burden and then think about how to minimize it. I think I already see a couple questions in the chat. What is this? Ah, perfect. We have a link from Hiroyoshi. Those who are interested in the ethics of research involving human subjects, see this. You can receive a certificate of completion. Yes, absolutely. We had to do this in one of my classes back in grad school. It's a nice little like online course that walks you through some of the basics of ethics training. Really useful. And again, it's nice to have that kind of standard formats that even if you're working in a setting with different like internal ethics standards, you have a point of reference just in case they don't have that strict internal documentation. Thank you so much for sharing that link. Any questions before I move along about respondent burden, why this stuff matters? I know in the past some students have been like, okay, but this has nothing to do with sampling. And that has led to some interesting discussions. So hopefully I've been able to get you on board with why this matters. But let me know if you have questions. If not, then saying all that, the fun part on brand for this course, we got to complicate things a little bit because of course we want to minimize burden as much as possible, but that as much as possible is what we need to focus on there. Because for some studies, the benefits that we can get from doing that survey, from taking that sample, they're enough justification for some level of burden on our participants. And this is where we bring in the idea of study value. So the projected societal or clinical or research benefits of some given study. So easy example, something with low study value could be a survey measuring what do university students think of their local coffee shops? Because, maybe it helps the businesses, maybe it helps those students, but for society as a whole, the greater good, it's not really doing that much. Compare that to a case with really high study value, right? We're doing trials of a new cancer treatment. The burdens could be really, really big here in terms of side effects, of potentially missing out on other more reliable treatments. But the potential benefits are obviously incredibly important all across society on kind of a large scale. We also have to consider as a dimension of study value, the value to the actual individuals participating and helping us with this study. This could be things like compensation. So, maybe I'm going to ask you a few questions, but you do get a $20 gift card to Tim Hortons, so that's an option. But these benefits can also be kind of non-tangible things like insight or knowledge. In my ethics application that I showed you the protocol for, there's a little statement like there's no material benefits for participating in the study, but the results could be helpful for self-reflection in discussing and illuminating hidden aspects of your research process. So those are also valid benefits to think about and document. We can also think about study value in terms of how likely is it that this study we're doing and proposing is going to be generating statistically significant results. So back to that idea of power that we talked about previously. So in this case, you're making the argument that yeah, I'm going to be burdening people a little bit more by asking some repeat questions for validation, but by validating my data, I'm decreasing the chance of false negatives or positives. So my results will be more reliable. That's a higher study value. So again, it's that kind of balance that we need to think about. One practical implication of our thinking about respondent burden is that it impacts our study design. So as we're thinking through burden and how much of it is acceptable, one element of our study that it shapes is sample size. So this goes back to that little equation that we saw. If there's zero net burden for each participant, we don't need to constrain our sample size on those ethical grounds. So zero burden times 1 million participants is still zero total burden. Now, if there is a net burden for each participant, then again, thinking of that equation, total study burden will increase as our sample size increases. Of course, our larger sample also increases the chance of generating significant or reliable results, which increases study value. So our general conclusion is that purely on an ethical level, not talking about accuracy or whatnot, a sample size can be justified on that ethical level if the projected value of the study at that sample size is greater than the total participant burden at that sample size. So for all of this burden that we are imposing, is our value worth it? Basically, that's the kind of question that we have to answer. Again, we wrote it as an equation. Sometimes it's not always something easily quantifiable, but that's the kind of balancing act that we're doing here. Because we have those two concepts, respondent burden versus study value, the balancing act there is a central discussion that we need to be having. If we can think of the research priorities activity that we did in class, where it was timeliness versus accuracy versus completeness, it's kind of like that, right? We're thinking about trade-offs. How do we minimize burden while still maximizing our chance of producing valuable results? Do we aim for what is ethically optimal or for what is ethically acceptable given our other goals? And these are really hard questions. There's no straightforward, simple answer to them. And that's why things like institutional research ethics boards, ethics departments in organizations in industry or government, even just supervisors and other team members are really important for helping us work through and determine what is appropriate or necessary for our particular data science project that we're doing. Again, strict ethics protocols will differ based on the organization or context in which you're doing that work, but these general principles of burden and value we can carry with us regardless of context. Any questions before we move into privacy about ethics, how we go about implementing this, anything that I've discussed, or how this affects your own work? If we're feeling okay about ethics on a higher level, then we can kind of dive into, I would say, a subtopic or a related topic, which is privacy. And again, I'll emphasize privacy could take up an entire class. It does take up entire classes and entire degrees. Today is an intro to the conversation of privacy in our data science sampling context. If you find it interesting, some resources linked on this slide, some more resources that I'll mention and link later in this slideshow that you can use if you want to research this at greater depth. But for now, let's start thinking about privacy and confidentiality. Huge topic in the world of data science ethics and the world of kind of data in general. Lots of legislation proposed and passed. Here, I think there's bills going through being modified. In Europe, they're doing a ton of work on data privacy. They're really at the forefront of this kind of work. For us in our sampling context, where we're just being introduced to these topics, let's define a few words and terms that you're likely to see and use when you're having those conversations out there about privacy as part of sample design. So to start off, data privacy. This is just the ability to control when and where your personal data are being shared. The reason that we care about data privacy is it helps us to mitigate informational risk. And that is just the potential for harm that comes from disclosure or sharing of your data. The classic example here is genetic data, like from those home DNA testing kits, 23andMe. If that data isn't private anymore, insurance companies or employers get a hold of that and they see some data saying, hey, this person's more likely to have some fatal disease, that's informational risk, right? They might not want to insure or to hire you. They could discriminate based on that data. You'll probably want to keep that kind of data private. One subset or type of data that we concern ourselves with when we're talking about privacy, when we're talking about risk, is personally identifying information, PII, your name, your address, your phone number, your age, your gender, arguably your genetic code. This is stuff that links measurements or observations to you as a person and is therefore personally identified. Lots of different ways that we can try to protect personally identifying information when we're designing a survey study. One of them is anonymization, and that's just the process of removing all of that personally identifying info from our data set. So whatever observations we're making, if it's height or weight or whatever, there's no names attached to it, no identifying numbers, whatever it is. We want to be very careful in the degree of anonymity that we are promising to the people who are participating in our survey. Because words like confidentiality and anonymity, these are words that, again, colloquially we may use interchangeably. They mean specific things. So if I say that all of our respondents will be granted confidentiality, that means that I, as the researcher or data scientist, I'm going to know who they are, but the final report or final products that I'm making will not reveal their identity. So in this case, I sit down with Sam. I know that I'm sitting down with Sam to get their answers to my survey, but in the report that I end up writing, Sam's name never appears. I just call them participant A says this is this. We can contrast that to anonymity, which is when even I, as the data scientist, I don't know the identity of my respondents. So for example, I post my survey online, Sam fills it out anonymously. I get to look at the answers in the data, but at no point do I know that Sam is the one who did that survey. Does that distinction make sense to us? Do we feel okay with confidentiality versus anonymity? Happy to give another example or explain in different words if that would be helpful. Okay, I'll keep going. So we have our key terminology, we have our kind of concepts that we're working with. Now let's think about some practical implications. Our favorite thing, what do we actually do with this stuff? How do we take these worries and put them into action when we're doing sampling? Lots of different ways that confidentiality concerns can impact our practice. A really big one is the medium through which we're collecting our data. So if we're doing in-person interviews or asking people to come to a location, who might see those people walking into our location, right? If we're doing a study at like a Planned Parenthood, for example, and people are seen walking into there, there's always protesters, there's always kind of things, people out there who might have differing ideas. We don't want to compromise our participants' privacy by making them walk into a place obviously affiliated with our study topic. If we're doing things digitally, we need to consider the software that we're using. There's a lot of third-party kind of private company softwares that people use to administer surveys online. We need to read the fine print as researchers and know if we administer a survey through this whatever website, do they automatically have access to our data? Are they tracking people's IP addresses and where they're answering from and making people input personal information or sign up for an account? These are all things that we need to keep in mind. If we're doing survey work as part of an institution like a university or some kind of company, oftentimes they'll have either internal resources telling you, hey, we pre-approve these tools that you can use. Or maybe not so much in government, but in industry, they'll say, we have our own platform for surveys, use this one, it's already secure, it meets our internal data policies. So these are things before we do sampling projects, we want to look at our options for how we're actually going to be taking in that data and think about the privacy implications. Who else might have access to seeing people or looking at their data? Next is how we're actually storing that data once we have it. What are we doing with it? Where are we keeping it? If it's on a computer, can anyone just go up to that computer and open it up and start scrolling through my Excel spreadsheets? Ideally, we want it to be password protected. If it's in a shared setting, if it's physical, like handouts, a paper survey, I think the usual standard is it's in a locked filing cabinet in a locked office. The only people who should have access to that are the people who were on the ethics protocol or who had approval to engage with that kind of data. If it's on a hard drive, are there backups? Who has access to that hard drive? If I'm carrying that hard drive around with me on my daily commute, how am I making sure that it is staying safe and not at risk during those transit times? And these are all, again, it might sound a little bit picky, but these are all things that have to be considered, especially if you're working with personally identifying information with any kind of classified or confidential or risky data. If we're storing things in the cloud, again, often institutions will have approved platforms, internal platforms where you can store your data. Usually when you're collecting survey data, we want to be very careful with storing it with cloud-based providers. For an example from my work, everything has to be stored in servers or in online repositories where servers are physically located in Canada exclusively. And again, this is just a data security privacy thing, going back to who can walk into this place and access these resources. Kind of going along with data storage, and I think I hinted at it, who can access this data? Shared offices. Do IT staff have right access to my hard drive and they can go in and look at the data even though they're not on the ethics approval? Are there other colleagues who share an office with me and they can walk right in and open my filing cabinet and start reading through people's personal surveys? Our kind of consideration with storage and with shared access, another balancing act we have to do, we don't want to have just one copy of our data in case something happens to it. We like to have backups. Cloud storage is not a bad thing at all. It's a useful thing. We just want to make sure that we're managing who can get into this data. Are they cleared or approved to look at this data? Again, based on our institutional regulations, based on our ethics approval, whatever is governing us in this case. Storing the data, getting the data, not enough. We got to think of what are we doing? How do we get rid of it years or months or weeks down the line? So we call these our retention and disposal plans. Again, this differs based on different institutions. Sometimes this is something that you have to decide and document as someone like proposing a data science project. Sometimes your organization will have existing plans for file retention and disposal that you just have to kind of follow the already there plans. These are things to look into and to ask about before you start obtaining data. Things like, how long do we keep data for? Why do we keep it for this amount of time? The easy answer is let's just keep it forever. Why would we ever get rid of it? But when you're collecting vast amounts of data, storage can quickly become an issue, especially maybe if you're in a smaller operation. If you're collecting terabytes and terabytes of data, that can become very expensive. So, some institutional policies are like, after 5 years, we go back and review the data. If it hasn't been accessed in, a year, then we'll delete it. So things like that are important to document and plan ahead for. And then if we get to that point of like, okay, we're done retaining this data, it's time to get rid of it. How do we dispose of it? Because remember, we're still thinking about privacy. We still don't want to just be putting our data out on the street where anyone can pick it up. If it's hard copies, we usually want it shredded or incinerated or destroyed in some way. If it's a digital file, we want to make sure it's actually deleted, not just, moved to a different folder and forgotten about. With all of that of like, we're getting our data, we're storing our data, we're getting rid of it, we're always keeping confidentiality in mind, but we want to be very, very clear with ourselves and also with our participants about the standard of confidentiality that we're actually promising them. So the easy question here, the common one that comes up is, what happens if in our survey or in our interview, someone discloses something illegal, intend to do something illegal or harmful to themselves or to others? Again, this is something policies will vary based on ethics, organizational guidelines, but we need to know those in advance, and we need to have those documented and communicated with our participants before we start the interview. So statements like, confidentiality is not absolute. A disclosure of personal information may occur if required by law. And again, if you're doing research on topics that are about something illegal, about topics that present legal risk to participants if disclosed, there are very specific protocols to follow, or some institutions may say, no, you just do not do this work. It's putting the participants at too much risk because, if the police come to you and say, I need you to give me this data, you won't have the option. You'll have to give them the data, and that's violating people's confidentiality. So again, we want to make sure we're including these statements. People know what they can expect, how much we're going to actually protect their data and what the limits of that are. If we're not going to protect their data, if we're not anonymizing it, we're not letting them have that confidentiality, why not? Now, I think in general, some degree of confidentiality is very often expected in these kind of studies. Probably the main exception where that wouldn't be the case is if we're doing work with key informants in their field. So, high-level politicians, expert academics in niche areas. Speaking as someone in research, it gets very, very, very specific. The like 5 other people in the world studying your topic. So in some cases, complete anonymity is just not very realistic. If I write an article saying, this is an interview with a high-level paleoethnobotanist who does machine learning genomics research, there's like 2 people doing that in that tiny field. So sometimes anonymity is just not feasible. And that's okay. The research can still happen, but we just need to communicate that clearly to the participants so they know you might be identifiable from participating in this survey. Now, as I keep saying, because I don't want you guys to take this as gospel regardless of your situation, different workplaces have different expectations, different requirements for the kind of privacy practices that you're implementing during sampling, during any data science or research work more generally. On this slide, there are a couple of different resources if you'd like to go through them to see the kind of things that institutions actually require data scientists to think about for privacy in their work. Who's in the chat? can't we keep all our surveys anonymous by default so people provide us the most valuable info but their identity? So usually some degree of anonymity is kind of the default, but you have to think about how are you implementing that anonymity, right? If you're doing your survey via a Google form, do they need to have a Google account to access that? Is anything being tracked in any way of how they're contributing that information? If you're doing your survey in person, how do you ensure that it's actually anonymous and that, you know, it's not always are they being seen walking in, but how do you ensure that you can then isolate this person contributed this information and keep it all collected like that? So anonymity by default is usually kind of a standard, but we still need to think about how we're implementing that anonymity and how we're going to protect it. And of course, other privacy elements like the storage and retention things that we discussed. Does that answer your question, Ina? Yeah, so again, like there's certain cases where confidentiality isn't an expectation. There's certain cases where it has limits, but we just have to clearly describe how we're implementing it, how we're protecting it. But good question. Anyone else? Questions about these couple of slides, these concepts? Oh, let me see if I was just wondering if there can be any other reason for not doing it. I'm trying to think. Like, honestly, in most of the studies that I've done, it's not usually like I'm trying to think of a scenario where it would be helpful for me to specifically identify the person. If they're a world leader is a common example. Like I'm thinking of one particular paper by a statistician that I know. She was having discussions with people who worked on a particular modeling project with the UN. So like it was relevant to state their names and their experience and the roles that they had because that kind of shaped the information and the answers they were giving. So in those kind of cases where the person's identity is relevant information to give context to their answers. In those cases, maybe less anonymity, less confidentiality, but usually there's some degree of identity protection. And even in those cases, one thing that sometimes happens is, I'm going to blank on the word for this. Cindy, if you know it, please feel free to jump in. But I'm blanking on it. They're like composite identities. So basically, you're collecting interview data from lots of different people, and then you can kind of create these personas. So I'm going to describe this so poorly. So I'll find a link and I'll share it during office hours, but you're basically kind of to give people still an idea that it's coming from a human being, instead of me saying the truth, which is Janice, the data scientist, said this, and Bob, the IT person, said this, I could say, Sam, a technologist from organization, said this. And again, you're making it clear that you're doing that this is a composite persona, but it's still a way of having that kind of human element in communicating your research while not exposing any one person. But I'll find a link if anyone is interested in personas and more of those qualitative approaches. If we're feeling okay about those concepts, how we might pursue them from, again, the storage, the communication, the retention perspective, then we can learn about another slightly more technical way that we think about participant privacy in our sampling work, and that's this idea of differential privacy. So I've got a short video that introduces the idea in very kind of plain language, nice animations and visuals, and then we'll walk through an example together in a little bit more detail of how it actually works. So I'll play this video and then we'll go through it together.
Companies are using more and more of our data to improve their products and services. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. It's better to measure what your users like.
So what happens when I load the video too early?
Users like than to guess and build products that no one wants to use. However, this is also very dangerous. It undermines our privacy because the collected data can be quite sensitive, causing harm if it would leak. So companies love data to improve their products, but we as users, we want to protect our privacy. These contradicting needs can be satisfied with a technique called differential privacy. It allows companies to collect information about their users without compromising the privacy of an individual. But let's first take a look at why we would go through all this trouble. Companies can just take our data, remove our names, and call it a day, right? Well, not quite. First of all, this anonymization process usually happens on the servers of the companies that collect your data. So you have to trust them to really remove the identifiable records. And secondly, how anonymous is anonymized data really? In 2006, Netflix started a competition called the Netflix Prize. Competing teams had to create an algorithm that could predict how someone would rate a movie. To help with this challenge, Netflix provided a dataset containing over 100 million ratings submitted by over 480,000 users for more than 17,000 movies. Netflix, of course, anonymized this dataset by removing the names of users and by replacing some ratings with fake and random ratings. Even though that sounds pretty anonymous, it actually wasn't. Two computer scientists from the University of Texas published a paper in 2008 that said that they had successfully identified people from this dataset by combining it with data from IMDb. These types of attacks are called linkage attacks, and it happens when pieces of seemingly anonymous data can be combined to reveal real identities. Another, more creepy example would be the case of the governor of Massachusetts. In the mid-1990s, the state's Group Insurance Commission decided to publish the hospital visits of state employees. They anonymized this data by removing names, addresses, and other fields that could identify people. However, computer scientist LaTanya Sweeney decided to show how easy it was to reverse this. She combined the published health records with voter registration records and simply reduced the list. There was only one person in the medical data that lived in the same zip code, had the same gender, and the same date of birth as the governor, thus exposing his medical records. In a later paper, she noted that 87% of all Americans can be identified with only 3 pieces of information: zip code, birthday, and gender. So much for anonymity. Clearly, this technique isn't enough to protect our privacy. Differential privacy, on the other hand, neutralizes these types of attacks. To explain how it works, let's assume that we want to get a view on how many people do something embarrassing, like, for example, picking their nose. To do that, we set up a service with the question, "Do you pick your nose?" and with the yes and no buttons below it. We collect all these answers on a server somewhere, but instead of sending the real answers, we're going to introduce some noise. Let's say that Bob is a nose picker and that he clicks on the yes button. Before we send his response to the server, our differential privacy algorithm will flip a coin. If it's heads, the algorithm sends Bob's real answer to our server. If it's tails, the algorithm flips a second coin and sends yes if it's tails or no if it's heads. Back on our server, we see the data coming in, but because of the added noise, we can't really trust individual records. Our record for Bob might say that he's a nose picker, but there is at least a 1 in 4 chance that he's actually not a nose picker, but that the answer was simply the effect of the coin toss that the algorithm performed. This is plausible deniability. You can't be sure of people's answers, so you can't judge them on it. This is particularly interesting if you're collecting data about illegal behavior, such as drug use, for instance. Now, because you know how the noise is distributed, you can compensate for it and end up with a fairly accurate view on how many people are actually nose pickers. Now, of course, the coin toss algorithm is just an example and a bit too simple. Real-world algorithms use the Laplace distribution to spread data over a larger range and increase the level of anonymity. In the paper, The Algorithmic Foundations of Differential Privacy, it is noted that differential privacy promises that the outcome of a survey will stay the same whether or not you participate in it. Therefore, you don't have any reason not to participate in the survey. You don't have to fear that your data, in this case your nose-picking habits, will be exposed. Alright, so now we know what differential privacy is and how it works, but let's take a look at who is already using it. Apple and Google are 2 of the biggest companies who are currently using it. Apple started rolling out differential privacy in iOS 10 and macOS Sierra. They use it to collect data on what websites are using a lot of power, what emojis are used in a certain context, and what words people are typing that aren't in the keyboard's dictionary. Apple's implementation of differential privacy is documented but not open source. Google, on the other hand, has been developing an open source library for this. They use it in Chrome to do studies on browser malware and in Maps to collect data about traffic in large cities. But overall, there aren't many companies who have adopted differential privacy, and those who have only use it for a small percentage of their data collection. So why is that? Well, for starters, differential privacy is only usable for large datasets because of the injected noise. Using it on a tiny dataset will likely result in inaccurate data. And then there is also the complexity of implementing it. It's a lot more difficult to implement differential privacy compared to just reporting the real data of users and anonymize it in the old-fashioned way. So the bottom line is that differential privacy can help companies to learn more about a group of users without compromising the privacy of an individual within that group.
All right. Hopefully that's a helpful, wrong section. Hopefully that's a helpful video. I really like it, I think, as like a first ever introduction to this concept. As we heard and hopefully got from that lovely description, the goal of differential privacy is so that we can analyze and share info about a data set without revealing information about any particular individual in that data set. The way that we do this is by adding random noise to our computations, and that obscures any single individual's contribution. I think that this image demos it really nicely. So in our traditional analysis, we get our data, it is what it is, we analyze it, and we get our output. With differential privacy, we get our input data, but before we're analyzing it, we add some small amount of random noise. This means that now our output will be an approximation, so we can't go into that output and pick out any one individual. So we have the idea. Now let's try walking through an example to see how this actually applies. So in this scenario, John is invited to participate in a study about the relationship between socioeconomic factors and medical outcomes in the US. They're asked to complete a questionnaire covering topics related to their finances and medical history. John is concerned that information he provides, like his HIV status, may be used against him if de-identified data is released and accessed by his insurance company. However, he recognizes that participating in the study would benefit the researchers and perhaps generate important results. So in this case, John's opt-out scenario is when he decides, okay, I don't want to participate, just do the analysis without me. The cool thing about differential privacy is that by adding in that little bit of random noise, we're making sure, number one, that John opting out will not majorly change our final outputs or results. And two, John's specific information, his personal information, will not be output by our work. Therefore, by participating, John is facing minimal additional informational risk. I lied before, there's a little bit more math symbols. The way that we denote this idea is with the privacy loss parameter. And we use this symbol epsilon to represent that, the additional informational risk that any individual would face beyond the risk when they opt out. So just in addition to any baseline informational risk they're already facing. When that privacy loss parameter is low, it means that our final analysis output will have lower accuracy, but we're protecting more privacy. Versus when the privacy loss parameter is high, our outputs will be more accurate, and we're incurring a little bit more informational risk. So again, visual format. If we're doing the analysis with individual privacy, including our friend John's data, versus if we do the analysis with differential privacy John's data, the difference between our outputs will be at most that privacy loss parameter percent. So if that is a small percentage, like we said before, it means that our outputs with and without John's data are very similar. So the output will be slightly less accurate, but John is more protected. And vice versa, right? If the outputs with John's data are very different from the output without, we're probably being a bit more accurate, but there's more informational risk for John's individual data as a person. And just to put a number on that, for those people who are more numerical, less visual, let's say that John thinks, okay, without doing the study, my probability of being denied insurance is 5%. Maybe adding his data to our database will increase that probability by 0.01%. Therefore, our privacy loss parameter is 0.01. There's that much kind of additional risk to him on top of just his normal everyday baseline. Now, as we saw in the video, as we just discussed, the way that we implement that differential privacy, once John or whoever decides to participate, we add random noise to our data. What I mean by that is let's say that we want to measure the proportion P of some trait in a population. So individuals who are over 6 feet tall. Of our sample size n many people, let's say that m many people are over 6 feet tall. They have that trait that we care about. So without differential privacy, we know that the proportion of individuals with that trait, it's just m over n, right? People over 6 feet divided by all the people that we sampled. With differential privacy, we're adding some random noise y. So instead of saying m number of people are over 6 feet tall, we're saying m plus y number of people are over 6 feet tall, with again, y just being some random, some value, some noise. To calculate our new proportion, our new p-value, not p-value in the traditional sense, our new p for probability, we're doing m plus y divided by n instead of just m over n. And here's where we can connect those two dots. So the magnitude, the size of our random noise y depends on that privacy loss parameter that we saw earlier. These two things are inversely proportional. So smaller privacy loss parameter, lower accuracy of our final analysis. That's because smaller privacy loss parameter, more noise is being added. So our y value is bigger. And we can see the relationship between the actual and the measured values of m as m prime minus m. So 1 over our privacy loss parameter, again, inversely proportional. And the way that we usually get that y value, the amount of noise that we're adding, like I mentioned it in the video, we sample it from our Laplace distribution with a standard deviation dependent on the privacy loss parameter. This is not one of the distributions that we covered way back in our first class, but it works in a pretty similar way. It's symmetrical around our mean here, so our random noise estimates are just as likely to be higher or lower than the true value. And as we can see here, right, where there's a bigger privacy loss parameter, a bigger epsilon value, it's more likely that the absolute value of y, the amount of random noise we're adding, is going to be a smaller value. And so our m prime will be closer to the actual m value. So likewise with our blue line down here, smaller privacy loss parameter, it's more likely for y to appear at one of these bigger values, right? It's not so much concentrated here in the middle. So adding more noise, our m prime will be a little bit more different from the real m value. Lots of concepts there. Anything I can re-explain, any questions about differential privacy, what it means to add noise to something?
So, Sierra, I just have one question. Like, I didn't get the graph properly. Like, so value of y on the x-axis and the probability of being sampled is on the y-axis.
So let's say that, so here we have a bigger privacy loss parameter, right? This is a higher value.
Okay, so because epsilon goes from 0 to 1, right? Max is 1.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, because it's a percentage. So let's say if we have this bigger value here, we can see on our graph, right? If we're randomly picking, there's more room to randomly pick one of these values because we're peaking here, right? So we're more likely to get a, 0.1 versus a 0.5. So we're more likely to pick kind of a smaller y value. So a smaller amount of noise that we're adding.
So the value of y, is it the absolute value of y, like on the x-axis?
Yeah, so that's when I say smaller or bigger, I'm saying either like smaller positive or smaller negative. So a smaller magnitude of noise being added.
Okay, yeah, I'm still a little bit rusty, but I will look into that later.
Is there any particular element that I could try to explain or that's giving you trouble?
No, I'm just trying to understand. Like, so I understand like this. Okay, when the epsilon goes higher, we are adding less noise, right? That's the whole idea, right? Because they're inversely proportional. So epsilon goes high, noise added becomes lower, and so the difference between the actual value and the change value becomes much lesser as well.
Yes, exactly.
But I'm just trying to wrap around my head on this graph here. But I think it'll probably, I will try to figure out. I think it's okay.
Okay, no worries. If you want to talk about it in office hours, we totally can. There's also going to be some more resources that I'll link that go through it in some more depth in case any of those.
So the other thing is, The
Yeah.
the differential what was the name again? The
Differential privacy.
yeah. So I'm just kind of understand how does it work. So you talked about this example of John, um, John being there and then John being deciding not to participate. So it is like we already have John's data, and then at some point he tells us, okay, he doesn't want to participate. So that's the situation, or is it like if he's not at all participating, we don't have his data anyway with us. Just trying to understand. Maybe I'm missing something
Yeah.
here.
So the idea is, so if we think about the height example that I said, right? We want to see people over 6 feet tall. So let's say the
Mhm.
actual value, our population is 100 people. There's 10 people over 6 feet tall, right? That's
Right.
our actual value. Because of whatever noise we're adding, let's say it comes out as 15 instead, right?
Hmm.
So if one of those tall people drops out, our final result, like it's still going to be 14 or 15, but we can't know if that changed result is because someone dropped out or if it's because of our noise. So there's that degree of, there's some wiggle room, right? Is it because Bob is in the study, or is it because we added some noise to include more tall people? So it's kind of blurring the individual contribution a little bit. Does that
Okay.
make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah. 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 Okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Good questions. Anyone else? Anything that I can talk over or clarify? It's kind of a weird thing to get your head around, but a useful one for when you got a big enough data set. And that's kind of the question that we have to think about. When is differential privacy the right choice for our particular study, our particular samples that we're taking? As always, I wish I could give you one answer of like, here's when you use it, here's when you don't. But you have to think about different priorities, the trade-offs between them. So first thing for us is this idea of accuracy. If we are applying differential privacy, we need to be doing it to a big enough data set that the extra noise is not going to matter all that much. If our sample size is only like 2 individuals and we add in a bunch of random noise, that's going to have a major impact on our outputs, right? The data set needs to be big enough for us to add noise without it completely demolishing our accuracy, the conclusions that we're reaching. Of course, we still have to consider informational risk. If we're doing multiple different analyses on our differentially private data set, if we're combining multiple different data sets together, we're increasing informational risk, right? We're increasing the ability of someone to do what they did in that video we saw and link data that we don't want them to link. So we just need to keep that in mind and balance. You know, we want to be accurate, but we don't increase the risk too much. How many other data sets are we bringing in here? What are we making available? All things to think about. And of course, when we're using differential privacy, we're always keeping ethics in mind. The main ethical consideration here is data sensitivity. People all have different ideas about what makes data sensitive, right? I might think, I do not want anyone except for my family doctor looking at my health data. Well, someone else might think, yeah, I don't care if it's anonymized, my name's not on it, use it for a study. So our assumption here, again, as data scientists, as data collectors, has to be that all data are potentially identifiable and potentially sensitive. There's no, magical type of data where we don't even have to think about privacy. We at least have to consider it, think about it, document our choices and decisions. So, it's fine if we can say, we've contemplated this data and we don't believe that there are any privacy risks because it's all whatever, petri dishes, cells in petri dishes. But we still have to document that and we still have to think potential privacy implications. There's also kind of the opposite idea of data sharing, because sharing data does increase informational risk, as we've seen, but there's also benefits to data sharing, right? If you read anything about open data, there's this idea that access to data can benefit other data scientists, other researchers. It can save them resources from having to go out and collect the same data all over again. It can benefit the general public, increasing transparency and accountability because they can go in, they can check our work for themselves. I like this little chart here because I think it captures the balancing act that we have to do kind of nicely. So if we don't share any data at all, there's no risk to our participants, but there's also no real benefits to society or anyone else, right? It's just kind of sitting there not being used. If we release all of our data to the public with no anonymization, everyone can potentially benefit and do research and use it. But there's massive risk to the individuals from whom we collected data. And that's why differential privacy is such a valuable idea, because it lets us live in this happy medium, right? Society can benefit, but we're also not overly increasing risk to any of our individual participants. Now, as I mentioned, last little resource to link, there's a lab group at Harvard dedicated to differential privacy and privacy tools more generally. This is their website. I guess I'll warn that it does get a little more technically advanced or technically detailed than what we've covered here today. So not in the scope of this course for us, but if you feel like digging into papers, lectures, videos about differential privacy in great depth, it's right there for you to explore and dive into. Last opportunity, or not last opportunity, but like before we move along, does anyone have any questions about differential privacy, privacy in general, ethics at all? Just looking at the time, that was actually all of our the last of the new content that we need to cover for sampling. Just to end off our content, I have a brief little review of the course. So if it's okay with you guys, we'll go through that little review, and then instead of giving you the break, I'll just let you get out of here a little bit early. So bear with me for a few more minutes while we go through an overview, kind of wrap up our sampling conversations, and get ready to move ahead to what comes next. We're going to kind of review what we covered in accordance with our learning outcomes. All summarized by the idea that this course will have been a success if you feel like you are now able to sit there with your data science questions at the early stage of your project and go, okay, these are the things I have to think about in order to choose and justify my sampling approach based on my particular question that I want to answer. So first learning outcome, we wanted to develop our ability to implement simple probability samples. We first had to figure out what probability even is. So looking at outcome spaces, all of our possibilities, and then events as specific sets of those possibilities. And we saw how we could plot out probabilities for different events using distributions. So for example, if every single event in our outcome space has an equal probability of occurring, we might see a uniform distribution, just our nice flat line. We also learned about the law of large numbers to help build our intuition about how sample size impacts our ability to accurately estimate means or different outcomes, basically getting the takeaway that as we sample more and more units, the proportion of those units exhibiting a certain trait will get closer to the true proportion of individuals in our target population with that trait. We start to see the middle of that normal distribution lift up, right? We see that the mean outcome on our x-axis has way more probability of occurring. We also defined our target, our frame, and our sample populations, getting into how we choose them, how we need to define our very clear inclusion or exclusion criteria for each one of them. And then we went into some detail about different probability sampling approaches. Simple random, stratified, clustering, systematic. We also learned that if we want to do any of those and we want to be able to accurately call it a probability sample, we have to know what's the probability of any one unit being included in that sample. Our non-response has to be random, and our samples have to be representative of our target population that we're trying to study. If it doesn't meet those criteria, we cannot call it a probability sample. Of course, we also wanted to be able to understand some slightly more complicated sampling procedures, some different trade-offs that come with choosing them, things like non-probability samples, right? Convenience, quota, purposive, snowball sampling. The ways that these samples are different from our probability samples. They're no longer representative of our target population. It's no longer true that every single individual had a chance of being sampled here. And then if we remember back to our activity with evaluating student understanding, we differentiated between surveys and observational studies. Remember that observational studies we're observing a system without intervening, right? Instead of doing a survey, maybe we're scraping social media data. We're sitting and counting the number of people who walk by, whatever it is. We discussed that survey and observational data, they're not against each other. We can use them to augment each other. So like enriched asking, where we're just linking observational data to survey data to make up for any missing info. There's also amplified asking. So we're, training a predictive model on a little bit of survey data and a whole lot of observational data, and then using the results of that model instead of having to administer a huge giant survey. We also spent time, now we're back on this week, identifying and understanding sources of error or inaccuracies in our data that could result from our sampling strategies. So variance, random error versus bias, which is systematic error. We learned that random error is something that we want to try to minimize, but to some extent, it's always kind of going to be there when we're sampling. Whereas bias, that's something that, at least in theory, we want to try and eliminate entirely. We talked about examples of the different kinds of errors. So over or under coverage, measurement error, maybe our survey tools are non-optimal, our data collection instruments are not getting us the info that we want, non-response, people just straight up not answering any of our questions. We have unit non-response or item non-response for particular questions. And then finally, we had my favorite, processing error. So typos, spelling errors, all those little annoying things that can affect the integrity of our data set. And then, of course, it's not enough to just be able to identify the errors. We also talked about how we can address them. What are some of the pros and cons of those different approaches? So adjusting the weights of parts of our sample to make up for missing data, bootstrapping, taking more samples with replacement from our original sample, seeing what kind of distribution of results we get, and then, of course, imputation, filling in those blanks in our data set with mean imputation through predictive models, through random sampling from our existing values, all those different approaches, all of which have good things and also potentially concerning implications for our data. And then last but not least, we wanted to develop our general intuition about survey quality. So assessing, is this survey, is this sample a good or a bad thing? We went over a ton of different measures of survey quality: relevance, timeliness, completeness. What are some trade-offs? How do we choose what we're prioritizing amongst those things? We also spent time with my beautiful, terrible survey exploring questionnaire design. So how do we actually construct a survey on the micro question level that's going to get reliable data from our participants, whether that comes down to phrasing our questions in plain language, thinking about the order that we're presenting our questions to avoid anchoring and priming. We talked about social desirability bias, right? Why people might lie to interviewers. Double-barreled questions. What happens when we try to combine two pieces of information in one question? Also, sensitive questions. How do we start to ask sensitive questions and minimize non-response? How do we make our surveys accessible to people in terms of medium, of time, incentives to complete them? And then, of course, today, ethics, privacy, anonymity. We just talked about it today, so I won't make us go over it all over again. That's our bird's eye view of the big topics that we discussed these past couple of weeks. I hope you're all feeling proud of how much new stuff you're able to learn, because it's definitely a lot, certainly a lot in 2 weeks. You know that you have your work periods, you have office hours, but from any of those big topics, any kind of last questions while we're all here as a class about sampling, how you might use them going forward, how any of them fit together? If not, then just to wrap us up, I want to revisit the point that I tried to make in our very first class, and that we've hopefully seen demonstrated since, which is that we can't just take for granted where our data come from, right? In this course, sometimes you get data, or in this certificate, sometimes you just get data from a website or provided with an example. In the real world, we got to think about where we're getting it from. There's no one sampling approach to magically make our data science good or right, but sampling is a thing that we have to think about. How we're designing our data gathering tools, how we're recruiting people, how we're processing our data to even have a shot at getting meaningful results. I used the example back in class 1 that all the analytical stuff, all the code writing that we're doing, that's the fillings of our data science sandwich. But sampling, that first piece of bread on the bottom, it is a part of the process, and it is an important one. It impacts our results, and it is just as important as the code we write, those beautiful complex models that we build, the final products that we end up uploading to Git or to wherever we're uploading them. But with that, I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you so much for making it this far. Aside from wrapping up your assignments, aside from those 2 last work periods you've got coming up, you've made it through your sampling course. I think you all did a really wonderful job. You engaged with the activities. I hope that you're feeling confident in your ability to take our practice examples from class and apply those in your own future data work. I'm seeing some people in chat. Oh, it's just thank you. Well, thank you guys. I won't bother saying a whole goodbye because you'll see me next week for the visualization course, but I'll just say again, thank you for your participation in class. By doing these activities together and sharing your answers, you really make the experience better for everyone. We all learn from each other. Thank you also to our wonderful learning supports, Adi, Cindy, Vishak, for their work and for helping in the chat and contributing where I don't know the answers. I'll still be here till 9 in case anyone has questions or wants to work on your last assignment, but we can leave a little bit early today. So thank you so much for your work. I see a raised hand. Patel, yes.
Yes, so I do have a question regarding the assignment too. And can we submit the assignment tonight because I want to go tomorrow outside. So
Yeah, if you're complete with assignment 2, you can absolutely submit it before the deadline.
okay, okay, no worries. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
You as well. Thank you, everyone in the chat. Oh, that was your raised hand. Okay.